the United States, and this is kind of an issue that is somewhat unique to the United States. There are other countries that do not have this many homeless people. Like in Canada, they have a very, very tiny number of homeless people compared to the United States. And it's also really hard to estimate the number, so it's probably much higher than the official number of 500,000. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, do you know how many are in India?
In India, I'm not sure, honestly. I don't know. And it's different governments track that differently. So some places, like in the United States, we have a federal agency that makes all cities do a one-night count of the homeless population, but I don't know if they do something like that in India. So I don't know if they would have an accurate estimate.
Well, accurate.
So out of the 564,000 people, 127,000 of those are children, okay? So that's a lot of kids that we're talking about being homeless across the United States. And out of all of the different states, New York has the second largest homeless population in the United States. California.
I saw it on the map.
Yeah, and California has more people than we do in New York. Like, we're talking about the whole state.
Florida has a lot.
Florida does have a lot too.
So New York, California, and Florida are the only states that have over 6% of the population are homeless.
Right. So thank you for showing that. Also, because Hawaii has only about 7,000 homeless people, but because the population,
Alaska's 2,000.
yeah, and if you think about how small the population of Hawaii is, that's actually a pretty big percentage of the population.
And then Wyoming only has 800.
Right.
I think Wyoming is in good shape.
Yeah,
Wyoming?
they are, and it's also, we'll talk about some of the reasons why New York has so many homeless
Because
people.
there's so many people in New York.
And
Yeah.
also because a lot of places, homeless people immigrate or like go to places like more cities.
Yeah, that's true as well.
So they can find jobs.
So that's homelessness in the U.S. Now we'll talk a little bit about who are the homeless people. We have these numbers, but who are the people behind those numbers? Like I said, there are a lot of people in New York City who have lost their homes, and those people either stay in homeless shelters, like Max was talking about in the video, or they sleep on the streets. And those are the people that you usually see and that you might think of when you say homeless. So the people you see sleeping on subway benches or other public places are often called street homeless people. That's the term. And mostly these people are adult men and women, many of whom have mental or physical health problems. Yeah.
Like they sometimes are drugs.
Sometimes,
Yeah.
but sometimes it's just
They're
that people, some people
yeah.
are born and their brains have a certain illness, and if they don't get the help that they need,
They still
sometimes
deserve
it can
a
be,
home.
right, they do still deserve a home, exactly, but it can be really hard for those people to, to work or to pay rent on time. And a lot of those people, the reason why they might be on the streets instead of in the shelter, like we said, is because if you have a sickness, it can be really hard for you to trust a big shelter or to trust an outreach worker who's coming. So those people are the hardest to reach, but they need the most help. Yeah.
Also, some homeless people are homeless, but they just pretend to be disabled.
Yeah, so that's a very small percentage of the
Yeah.
total population. I mean, if you're talking about a group of tens of thousands of people, there are going to be some people who maybe aren't being completely honest, but most people are homeless because they don't have any other place to stay. No one wants to be homeless, and that's the important thing to remember. Yeah.
Also, in California, they have this place where the reason why there's a lot more homeless people on the streets in California is because I've heard this story about the people put there's this one street that a lot of
Yeah.
I forget what it's called.
Skid Row. Yeah, so the interesting thing if you're comparing California to New York is that, like I said, in New York we have a right to shelter. So most of the people who are homeless in New York City are sleeping in a shelter, whereas California does not have a right to shelter. So they only have a couple shelters, and then if you're homeless and you need a place to stay for that night, they'll say, I'm sorry, the shelter's full, and then you have to sleep on the street. which is why in Los Angeles specifically, you walk around and you see so many people in need, whereas in New York, it's actually a smaller percentage of people are on the street, but more people in shelters. Yeah.
And also, another place that has a lot of homeless people is Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and Philadelphia has a lot, and that's also another place where you don't have a right to shelter. So New York is sort of unique in that we have this guarantee that the city will provide a bed for you if you need it.
Are there like places to bathe in homeless shelters?
Yes. Yeah, and I'll get into more. I have some pictures of what it's like in the shelters as well. How about we move on and then I'll
Can I
answer.
just ask a question?
Okay.
Are there any other states that have the
Right to shelter.
No, and actually the right to shelter is just in New York City and then I think Westchester County as well. So even if you're in, I'm from Binghamton, New York, which is about 3 hours north of here. And if you're homeless there and the shelter's full, they won't necessarily give you a bed. They won't find a place for you. So it's really New York City that's sort of leading the entire country in having the right to shelter, and that's because of the Coalition for the Homeless. Yep.
Is the United States the country with the most homeless people?
I don't actually know because I think like I said, different governments count the number of homeless people differently. So I think if you're talking about wealthy nations, I believe that we have the most, but it's really hard to compare, the United States to, for example, I was in Bangkok and there were a lot of homeless people in Bangkok, but they don't necessarily count them. So you can't say how many people there are that.
But then, like maybe in China, there might be a lot because they don't have room.
Right.
Maybe
So
for
you don't-
because they have like
Yeah.
they have like 1.5 billion people. in
Right.
China.
And they
Right.
recently actually made it so you can now have 2 children in China instead of only having 1 kid.
Right. So it's interesting that, you don't really know.
They used
For
to
a
be in
long
China
time.
for a
Used to
long
only have
time.
one
You
kid.
only have 1 kid.
Yeah. And they
When you have
feed-
twins, you have to decide which twin that you give to an orphanage.
Anyway, so yeah, it's hard to compare. It's hard to compare the United States to other countries, but we can compare New York to other states, and we know that we have a lot of people who are homeless.
So let's let Jackie continue, okay? And remember, we're keeping our questions for the end.
All right, so this is, I don't know if you guys can see a picture, but this is a homeless family in this picture here.
happy.
They do look happy because these people were actually getting help from the coalition when we took this picture. So they were happy that we were there for them, even though they're not happy about
They
being
have a really
homeless.
young child.
They do, and that's something very interesting is I'll talk about homeless children, and most of the homeless children are very young. You're talking about, there are a lot of babies and toddlers and kids who are in kindergarten and younger who are in the shelter system.
One time I was walking in the subway in that long tunnel,
Mm-hmm.
and I saw a mom with like a 5-year-old that was homeless. And the thing that was good was like I always like to I always feel happy when people that are homeless have food.
Yeah.
And so they each had like a pretty good like a pretty big grocery bag of food. So someone gave them like enough, some organization, maybe the coalition, gave them enough money so that they could get a grocery bag of food.
Yeah.
Or they were on the streets for so long, like 5 months.
Well, there are different government programs too that called. I mean, we call it food stamps. That's not the official name, but it's basically money that is given to people to purchase groceries. But some people might not know about those programs or might not be able to apply for them, and that's where groups like the coalition step in and make sure that people know about those resources.
And the good thing was that the kid was like really smiling.
That's
He
good.
was really happy.
That's really good. Yeah.
I live close to the Gowanus houses.
Okay. Yeah. Are they? I don't know if those are shelters or if that's public
But they're-
housing.
It's public
There-
housing.
That's public housing.
Yeah, but they're still for people who are really poor.
Yeah, and that's actually it. I mean, we support, moving people out of shelters into public housing because that's a really great, it's guaranteed to be affordable for them, and we'll talk more about why unaffordable housing is part of the reason why there are so many homeless people in the city. Let's talk a little bit about this, and then we'll go to a lot more questions at
Wait a
the
minute.
end.
I just because I watch a lot of HGTV shows,
Okay.
which is a real
Yeah.
estate.
Yeah.
Channel, and I read and I saw that the real estate market in San Francisco is really high, so that's probably why there are so many homeless people.
And
these houses cost a lot.
yes, and that's
I mean,
a
in
big
New York, houses cost a lot too.
right, which is why San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York City all have big homeless populations, and it's directly related to the cost of housing here. Yep.
And in like Salt Lake, you could buy like a normal, nicely sized house for the amount of money you could buy a one-room apartment.
Yep. And
in New York.
it's interesting you mentioned Salt Lake because Salt Lake City is actually
I've been-
really, really good. They've housed most of their homeless population because there's so much affordable housing there, and they're seen as sort of this success story.
There's some
Except
really
for-
big
yeah.
Houses in like Hollywood.
Yeah, but even just getting an apartment there is very affordable. So, yeah, like I said, most of the people
And
who
it's
are
a nice
homeless in New York City are sleeping in shelters. They're not on the streets, and you wouldn't see them or know that they're homeless by looking at them. Next time you get on the subway, there might be someone who's homeless, like a homeless child and their mom. And you could be sitting next to them, and you wouldn't even know that they're homeless. Like, you wouldn't know if you saw Max walking along on the street, you wouldn't know that he was homeless.
You watched the video, so you might.
Yeah, but if you saw him before watching the video, you wouldn't say that person's homeless, but he is.
Unless you had a homeless.
No, if he kind of looks like not the best clothing and like not.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can but some people, yeah, I mean, some people are
they just
poor,
look
but
like they're from a family that doesn't have too much money.
yeah,
It doesn't throw around their
Also, some people just wear like plain clothes.
yeah, you never know, right?
Like some people just wear like regular tank tops and like stuff like that.
Like just a black shirt.
And they're just like.
So when we're talking about the homeless population in New York City, most of the people in homeless shelters are families. So moms, dads, and their kids, a lot of young kids like we talked about. So how many homeless kids are there in shelters just tonight? 23,000 homeless children will sleep in
Tonight?
shelters
Exactly
just
tonight?
tonight. Yeah. It actually might even be higher because these are the numbers from July, and it's been going up every night, unfortunately. It isn't. So here's some basic facts about homelessness in New York City. So in July, a couple months ago, there were 60,456 homeless people, including 15,156 families with 23,425 children sleeping each night in the shelter system. That's a lot, yeah, and I'll help you kind of process what those numbers mean in just a second. So more than 3/4 of the homeless shelter population in New York City are people and families. Now, I heard that you guys have done some work on, racism and the intersection of race in poverty. So it's interesting to note that most of the people sleeping in shelters are people of color in New York City. So out of the shelter population, it's 58% African American, 31% Latino, 7% white, 1% Asian American, and 3% unknown. So you can see that a lot of the people who are homeless are people of color, and those are the people who are really suffering from the homeless crisis.
Wow, there's not that many Asian Americans.
No. But there are a lot of Asian Americans who are living in, like, doubled up in apartments, so they're not in a shelter, but they're not in a safe living situation either. So,
What do you mean?
so they might be in a 1-bedroom apartment with 3 families in it instead of 1 family in it. And that could be really, really hard. So again, these are a lot of numbers that I'm throwing out here. How many of you have been to Yankee Stadium?
I've been to it for a soccer game.
Yeah, it's big, right? You're walking around, and I mean, I was walking up the stairs there once, and I got dizzy because of how big it was.
This team NYCFC.
Yeah, they play at
Yeah,
the
they
stadium.
play in Yankee Stadium.
They they put like grass over the baseball diamond.
Yeah, and they play a whole
Yeah,
soccer
like
game there.
the field is shaped like this, like that.
Like
it's
on
like
a diagonal,
that.
right?
So the field is straight, and then there's a triangle down the side, and it's like that.
Yeah, it's
Because of the
pretty
size.
big. It's a really big stadium. So
Yeah.
picture Yankee Stadium if you've been there. There's a picture here, but it's huge. So the total number of people in New York City shelters is about 60,000 people. just tonight. That's not including all the people who are on subways and parks and things.
Well, and even more than that.
Right. So if all of the homeless people who are just in shelter went to Yankee Stadium, they would fill every single seat at Yankee Stadium, and 10,000 more people would have to stand. So next time you're at Yankee Stadium, look around and say there aren't even enough seats in this place to put all of the homeless people in New York City. That's how bad the crisis is. Just in shelter. So that doesn't include thousands more people who sleep on the streets or other public places. And that's probably about an extra 6,000 people who are not in shelter, who are homeless in the city. Yeah.
Which is